May 12, 1943, 1347. In the North Atlantic at 47°23'N, 19°41'W, Captain Heinrich Vogel stood in U-537's conning tower, peering through salt-encrusted binoculars at the flat horizon. Around him, 7 other U-boats steamed on the surface, in daylight, a formation that ran counter to every hard-learned maxim of submarine warfare forged during 4 brutal years in the Atlantic. In less than a quarter of an hour, all 8 vessels would be destroyed, not by destroyers or corvettes, but by aircraft operating far beyond where the submariners believed planes could reach. The Americans called those long-range bombers Liberators, and that spring afternoon they lived up to the name with the most catastrophic 15 minutes the U-boat arm had yet endured. The disaster that struck in mid-Atlantic on 12th of May 1943 had its origins 6 weeks earlier, inside the concrete pens of Lorient, France. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, had summoned his senior U-boat leaders for an emergency meeting. The issue on the table was simple and terrifying. Allied air power was choking off the wolfpack tactics that had almost decided the Battle of the Atlantic. Captain Heinrich Vogel, who led the 9th U-boat flotilla, put forward a radical plan later recorded in Kriegsmarine operational files. His study of Allied patrol routines suggested a gap, a band roughly 600 to 800 nautical miles from Newfoundland, where air coverage ought to be impossible. The consolidated B-24 Liberator had a published maximum range of about 2,100 miles. But when carrying full bombs and conducting patrol duty, its effective radius from coastal bases was substantially reduced, roughly 600 miles. Vogel's proposal was precise. By assembling a surfaced column of 8 U-boats through the mid-Atlantic gap, they could sustain speeds near 17 knots, roughly 3 times their submerged pace of 5 or 6 knots, and cross the ocean in about 5 days instead of the 15 a single submerged transit would require. The arithmetic seemed airtight. The gap spanned roughly 400 nautical miles. Allied patrols would need many hours to reach its edge, and that left them little time to loiter on station. Kriegsmarine Command approved the plan, Operation Sea Devil, on 3rd April 1943. 8 Type 9 boats with extended range were chosen. Kriegsmarine records show these boats displaced about 1,120 tons surfaced, carried 22 torpedoes, and were fitted with 37mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns. The selected boats were U-537, U-541, U-543, U-546, U-548, U-552, U-558, and U-564. What German intelligence could not foresee was that British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had effectively closed Vogel's safe corridor. Modifications recorded in RAF Coastal Command logs, removal of some armor, installation of auxiliary fuel tanks in bomb bays, and optimization of cruising altitude extended the Liberator's practical patrol radius to about 850 nautical miles. The Americans began flying these very long-range Liberators from Newfoundland in March 1943, steadily eroding the mid-Atlantic gap on which Vogel's calculations relied. Signals intelligence from Bletchley Park tracked German preparations for Operation Sea Devil from mid-April, and both RAF Coastal Command and U.S. Navy anti-submarine units were alerted that a U-boat movement was imminent. Late on 11th May 1943, the 8 U-boats rendezvoused about 150 miles southwest of Iceland. Vogel's operational order, recovered from wreckage after the war, directed 2 columns of 4 boats each with 500-meter spacing, a zigzag change of course every 20 minutes, and continuous air watch on all vessels. The formation submerged during dawn twilight and surfaced at 08 to begin the run across what they believed to be a safe zone. They were already under observation. Lieutenant Commander James Harrington of U.S. Navy VP-84 had been airborne from Argentia, Newfoundland, since 05:30 on 12th of May. His B-24D Liberator, Atlantic Reaper, carried cutting-edge anti-submarine modifications. A reduced crew of 8 to save weight, fuel tanks occupying every available compartment, the normal payload replaced by 8 depth charges and 8 500 lb general-purpose bombs with hydrostatic fuses. Its ASV Mark III radar, operating at 10-centimeter wavelengths and field-tested only 6 weeks earlier, could detect a surfaced submarine at up to 12 miles under good conditions, a capability unknown to German naval intelligence. The U-boats steaming on the surface were essentially broadcasting a radar signature as clear as a beacon. At 13:32, the Liberators radar operator, Petty Officer Robert Kellerman, picked up multiple returns at bearing 047 degree, range 18 miles, 8 distinct contacts in formation. Harrington's after-action statement in U.S. Archives records his instant appraisal. 8 surface contacts in military order, spacing and movement consistent with a wolfpack. Proceed to attack altitude. The tactical picture favored the attacker. Approaching from the southeast with the sun at their backs, the Liberator made visual detection difficult. The U-boats, watching north and west where they expected danger, held their eastward course at 17 knots. Though the 8 boats collectively mounted some 64 gun barrels on paper, their anti-aircraft defense depended on early warning to man stations. Harrington descended to 200 FT at about 210 knots. His co-pilot, LTJG Thomas Brennan, armed all 16 of the aircraft's weapons. Bombardier Ensign David Walsh took his place in the nose. The nose gunner manned twin 50 caliber guns. The plan was brutally straightforward. A straight strafing run along the formation, releasing ordnance in 3-second intervals. At 13:45, lookouts on U-552, the last boat in the western column, sighted the Liberator. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Förster, commanding U-552, radioed the warning. Aircraft bearing 135, low, closing fast. That transmission, intercepted by Allied listening posts, would be U-552's final message. 7 U-boat commanders simultaneously faced the nightmare they had feared, caught on the surface by a 4-engine bomber with nowhere to run. Emergency crash dive drills required roughly 30-35 seconds from alarm to being fully submerged. The Liberator was only about 40 seconds away. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled, but centralized coordination was impossible. Each captain had to decide, instantly, dive and become a largely immobile target, or stay on the surface and attempt to fight with hastily manned guns. Vogel, at the head of the formation in U-537, made the fateful choice. He ordered all boats to remain surfaced and engage. It would be the last order he ever gave. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. And if this account moves you, subscribe. Tomorrow I've got something special lined up. At 13:47:12, the Liberators' forward guns opened up from about 800 yards. Tracer rounds, every 5th round tipped with phosphorus for visibility, cut toward the lead U-boat in straight, glowing streaks that seemed almost slow to the eye. Each 50 caliber bullet, weighing roughly 1.7 ounces and traveling about 2,900 feet per second, reached U-537's conning tower in 1.2 seconds, and the result was instant and lethal. Captain Heinrich Vogel, still standing with binoculars to his eyes, took 3 hits at once as armor-piercing incendiaries tore through the thin conning tower plating like tissue paper. 4 other men on the bridge were killed within the first 2 seconds. The lookout trying to man the 37mm never made it, toppling backward into an open hatch and jamming the emergency dive mechanism. At 13:47:18, the Liberator's Bombardier dropped the first depth charge, a 650 lb Mark 44 set to detonate at 25 feet. It hit the sea about 40 feet ahead of U-537's bow, the hydrostatic trigger functioning exactly at 25 feet and unleashing roughly 300 lb of torpex, about half again as powerful as TNT, in a colossal underwater blast. The shockwave moved through. The water at some 5,000 FTS, U-537's bow was catapulted clean out of the sea by the force. The pressure-resistant forward bulkhead, designed for slow compression at depth, could not survive an instantaneous near-contact shock. Rivets ripped free along forward seams, seawater blasted into the torpedo room, and the damaged bow drove downward. Within 8 seconds of the explosion, the bow was angled about 45 degrees toward the bottom, events that would carry her down to some 2,400 feet. The Liberator kept its strafing run at 200 feet and roughly 210 knots. 3 seconds after the first charge, the second fell toward U-541. Lieutenant Werner Hartmann had managed a crash dive. His conning tower hatch was sealed and the planes were set hard down. The boat reached about 15 feet when the depth charge detonated 30 feet off the stern at the worst possible point in the descent. The stern was still near the surface while the bow had already started down, presenting maximum area to the blast. The after torpedo room was crushed, fuel tanks ruptured, and diesel mixed with seawater to create a vast burning slick. The stern rode up toward vertical as forward flooding pulled the bow down. 47 men perished in the darkened compartments as their boat became a sealed tomb. U-543, under Oberleutnant Hans Jürgen, as recorded, tried to retaliate. Her 37mm crew reached their gun and opened fire, the weapon able to throw about 80 rounds a minute. Shells struck the Liberator's port wing, tearing holes in aluminum skin but failing to disable vital systems. The Liberator's return fire cut down 4 of the 5 gunners instantly. At 13:47:24, the third depth charge exploded directly beneath U-543's pressure hull. The submarine was catapulted out of the water. Internal crew were hurled against bulkheads with bone-shattering force. The hull split with a sound like a cannon, and the boat broke in two and sank in under 20 seconds, taking all 52 hands with her. 12 seconds had passed since the attack began. 5 U-boats remained, and the Liberator still carried 13 weapons. We've spent a lot of time preparing and telling this account, so if you like it, please subscribe. It really helps. Returning to the timeline reconstructed from Liberator debriefs and German log fragments, at 13:47:30, 18 seconds into the strike, U-546 achieved what would be the formation's lone successful emergency dive. Corvettenkapitän Dietrich realized surface combat was futile the moment U-537's conning tower blew apart. His crew executed the crash dive precisely. The hatch slammed, vents opened, ballast tanks flooded, and the bullplanes drove to full down. The submarine reached 30 feet when the fourth depth charge detonated about 50 feet away. At that depth, the pressure hull withstood the shock. The boat shook violently. Lights shattered and men were thrown against equipment, but the hull held. Dietrich ordered 200 feet and flank speed, and U-546 escaped, scarred but still operational. Of the 8 boats in Operation Sea Devil, she alone would survive. 48 men owed their lives to that instant decision to dive, while the price of survival was abandoning 7 sister boats, a choice that would haunt every survivor thereafter. The Liberator's bombing and strafing continued with ruthless effectiveness. At 13:47:36, the fifth depth charge detonated near U-548, rupturing diesel lines and igniting fuel. The submarine caught fire and a burning oil slick raced across the sea faster than men could swim. 23 men leapt overboard. 18 burned to death in the flames. 5 who were rescued from the water 3 hours later by a Canadian corvette carried such severe burns that 2 of them died while being evacuated to Newfoundland. U-552, the boat whose lookouts first sighted the Liberator, faced the 6th strike at 13:47:42. Her commander, Kapitän Lieutenant Klaus Förster, had kept the boat on the surface trying to bring every AA weapon to bear. 20-meter guns chattered hundreds of rounds. The 37mm fired steadily, yet none of their fire found a vital part of the bomber. The Liberator's multiple gun positions exacted savage retribution, killing or wounding every man on deck. The depth charge that destroyed U-552 detonated beneath the control room, rupturing the pressure hull in several places at once. The submarine sank bow first at nearly a 60-degree angle. Seawater poured through the breaches with such force that men in forward compartments were crushed against bulkheads, and the entire vessel vanished beneath the surface in roughly 14 seconds. No survivors. At 13:47:48, 36 seconds after the strike began, U-558 took the 7th depth charge. Her commander had tried to outrun the danger on the surface, throttling diesels to emergency and pushing the boat to about 18 knots in a frantic bid to escape. The charge detonated shallow, and the resulting pressure wave struck the stern at an angle, seizing the rudder hard to starboard and wrecking the port propeller shaft. U-558 immediately entered an uncontrollable spin, circling at high speed with no steering or ability to dive. Water poured in through the damaged shaft seal. The crew abandoned the aft compartments as the boat listed and flooded. 36 men leapt into the sea. The submarine continued its deadly turn for another 2 minutes before water finished flooding her, and she sank. 29 of the 36 were later picked up by Allied vessels. The other 7 succumbed to hypothermia in roughly 44 degrees of water before help could reach them. 1 minute after the Liberator opened fire, 7 U-boats were destroyed or fatally crippled. Only one remained, U-564, under the command of 26-year-old Oberleutnant zur Reinhard Surin, with 9 weapons still aboard and barely seconds to live. Surin had one tactical edge his sisters lacked: time to watch and learn. 60 seconds of carnage had shown that remaining surface invited instant annihilation, while a standard dive left a boat helplessly exposed to the bomber's remaining ordnance. He chose a third rule-defying course: to fight while diving. At 13:47:54, as the Liberator passed the burning wreck of U-558, Surin barked orders preserved in survivor testimony: all hands to diving stations, prepare for crash dive. Crews at the guns remain and fire until water reaches the weapons. Engine room, maintain full power until I order the dive. The tactic was audacious and seemed insane, but it was U-564's only chance. As the bomber turned for a second run, the 37mm and 20mm crews opened up. Having watched the aircraft's attack profile, they now aimed far more accurately and stitched holes across the Liberator's fuselage. One 37mm shell slammed into a starboard waist gun position, killing Seaman First Class Daniel O'Connor and wounding the port waist gunner. Another round punched into the radio room, wrecking communications gear but sparing the operator by chance. Lieutenant Commander Harrington later recorded that the aircraft had sustained multiple hits, yet the crew elected to press the attack because the target posed a threat to Allied shipping. The Liberator lined up for its second pass at 13:48:10, approaching lower and faster at about 150 feet. Surin watched from the bridge and ordered the emergency dive when the bomber was roughly 600 yards out. All guns cease fire and clear the deck. Gun crews abandoned their weapons and scrambled for the hatch. Surin was last across the sill, slamming the conning tower shut as seawater already flowed over the forward casing. U-564 began her dive at 13:48:18. The Liberator, 400 yards away and closing at about 220 knots, would release the next depth charge in roughly 6 seconds. The attacking crew now faced a complex aiming problem. U-564 was diving on a forward track and therefore would not be where a stationary calculation predicted. Bombardier Ensign Walsh had only an instant to compute where the submarine would be when a depth charge reached its set depth. Under that pressure, with wounded shipmates screaming nearby, Walsh released at 13:48:22. The charge fell, struck the sea, and tumbled through the air before hitting the water above where U-558's stern had been. U-564, however, had already descended to approximately 40 feet. The hydrostatic fuse was set for 25 feet, and the weapon passed beneath the pressure hull without detonating there. It exploded at its preset depth some 80 feet astern. The blast cracked deck plating and blew out interior light bulbs, but did not breach the pressure hull. U-564 continued down to 250 feet, leveled off, and proceeded east at slow speed. Surin, blood trickling from a head wound, realized he had been spared by a narrow margin. Above, the Liberator circled and searched the debris field. With fuel running low and the submarine gone, the aircraft turned for home. At 13:48:45, the attack concluded. Elapsed time, 1 minute and 33 seconds. 7 U-boats had been destroyed or disabled. 68 men floated in the water. Kriegsmarine losses from the action numbered 382 dead or missing. The Liberator Atlantic Reaper climbed to 1,000 feet and headed northwest at 1349 for the long flight back to Argentia, with about 900 gallons of fuel remaining, just enough to return with a thin reserve. Her crew tended the wounded and tallied damage. 23 holes in the skin, 1 fatality, 2 wounded, the starboard waist gun wrecked, and radios knocked out. For that price, the bomber had shattered a wolfpack and cast 68 men into the freezing North Atlantic. Those left alive from Operation Sea Devil struggled in 44-degree water. Captain Friedrich Alrek of U-548, blown overboard and clinging to an ammunition crate with 3 other men, glanced at his watch, still running despite salt water, and saw 1355. The attack that had destroyed everything he knew had lasted under 2 minutes. Rescue did not come from the direction the Liberator had flown. At 1442, the Canadian corvette HMCS Drumheller, part of escort group C2, received a coded transmission from Argentia relaying precise coordinates and reporting multiple U-boat sinkings with survivors in the sea. Commander Anthony Griffin turned Drumheller hard and raced at maximum speed, 16 knots, toward the reported position, arriving at 1820 4.5 hours after the engagement. Late afternoon light slanted over an apocalyptic scene. Oil slicks spread for square miles, and floating debris marked where the submarines had vanished. Wooden planks, life vests, personal belongings and bodies, and some still moving, most not, bobbed among the wreckage. Griffin's after-action notes in the Canadian Naval Records described the scene with cold detail that barely concealed the horror underneath. At roughly 44 degrees, an unprotected swimmer could expect about 90 minutes before hypothermia rendered him unconscious. 4.5 hours had passed. Of the 68 German sailors who had entered the sea, Drumheller's crew recovered 42 survivors, 31 brought aboard alive and 11 dead from exposure, still wearing life vests that kept them afloat after death. 26 bodies were never found, claimed by the Atlantic depths with the submarines they had left. The rescued men, suffering hypothermia, shock, and in several cases severe burns, were crowded into Drumheller's sickbay and crew berths. Sailors who only hours earlier might have been enemies now worked frantically to save lives. Hot coffee, blankets, dry clothing, medical care. The shift from foe to fellow human happened quickly and without fuss. Griffin recorded that, even without a shared language, Canadian and German seamen communicated perfectly through the universal language of suffering. Captain Friedrich Alrek, the senior surviving officer, formally surrendered to Commander Griffin at 1945. There was no ritual sword surrender. Alrek had lost everything but his life vest. He gave his name, rank, and serial number, acknowledged his status as a prisoner, and asked that the names of the dead be recorded. Griffin honored that request. Alrek's trembling handwriting on Drumheller stationery preserved the roll of 382 Kriegsmarine submariners who perished on 12 May 1943. The corvette set course for Halifax. Arriving at 8:20 on 15th of May, survivors were transferred to prisoner-of-war camps while the dead, sewn in canvas and weighted, were committed to the sea with full military honors during the voyage home. A dignity Griffin insisted on despite objections from crew members who resented honoring enemy dead. Intelligence work began before Drumheller docked. Naval officers boarded. Interrogations started while medical teams continued to stabilize the worst cases. And the prisoners, exhausted and shell-shocked, supplied information that reshaped Allied understanding of German U-boat practice. The captured testimony confirmed. Operation Sea Devil, the deliberate daylight formation crossing of 8 U-boats through what Berlin had believed to be an air gap, and revealed catastrophic failures in German naval intelligence. Declassified interrogation summaries later showed the Kriegsmarine had been unaware of very long-range Liberator modifications, ignorant of ASV Mark III radar, and had not expected coordinated patrols guided by signals intelligence. The 15-minute annihilation of 7 U-boats was not simply the result of tactical mistakes by individual captains, but of systemic intelligence failures at the highest level. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz received word of the disaster on 14th of May 1943 at BDU headquarters in Berlin. 7 U-boats lost in a single action was the worst single-day loss the submarine arm had suffered to that point. Its psychological effect outweighed even the material toll. If formation transits in the mid-Atlantic were no longer safe, if Allied aircraft could reach areas once considered secure, and if radar could locate surfaced submarines beyond visual range, then the strategic premise of wolfpack attacks had collapsed. BDU orders issued on 16th of May 1943 enforced a doctrinal shift. Daytime formation sailing was banned. Submarines were to transit alone and remain fully submerged during daylight hours, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries. The offensive wolfpack doctrine that had so threatened Britain's Atlantic lifeline was abandoned for cautious evasion. Those 15 minutes over the mid-Atlantic marked a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic and hastened Germany's defeat at sea. The lone surviving U-boat from Operation Sea Devil, U-546, continued operations until 24 April 1945, when she was sunk by the destroyer escort USS Flaherty in the closing weeks of the European War. Her captain, Paul Dietrich, perished with the boat. Of the men who survived 12th of May 1943, only 16 lived to surrender at war's end, carrying lifelong guilt for escaping while 382 comrades died, a burden documented in post-war psychiatric studies of U-boat veterans. Lieutenant Commander James Harrington was awarded the Navy Cross for the action on 12th of May. His citation praised his aggressive attack under heavy anti-aircraft fire that removed a major threat to Allied convoys. He flew 37 more combat missions before rotating home in November 1943, survived the war and died in 1987 at 72, never speaking publicly about the quarter hour that killed 382 men. The 31 German survivors spent the remainder of the war in POW camps in Canada and the United States. While Geneva rules barred compulsory military labor, many volunteered for farm work to help ease labor shortages. Their post-war testimony recorded that humane Canadian treatment, respectful and in line with international law, changed their perspective on the enemy they had fought. Friedrich Alreck, senior survivor of U-548, returned to Germany in 1947 and later became a merchant mariner. In 1963, he attended the christening of HMCS Marguerite, Drumheller's successor, as an honored guest, and in remarks preserved in the Canadian Naval Archives credited Commander Griffin and his crew for showing the honor warriors can extend to defeated foes, saving lives and treating prisoners with dignity when little could be expected in return. The 15 minutes over the North Atlantic on 12th of May 1943 demonstrated how industrial capacity, technological innovation, and tactical daring could overcome an adversary that had dominated submarine warfare for 4 years. Long-range Liberators reaching farther than expected, radar the Germans did not know existed, depth charges delivered with deadly accuracy despite intense anti-aircraft fire. The combination proved irresistible. Today, the coordinates 47°23' being 19°41' bear no monument. The ocean keeps its secrets. 7 U-boats lie 2,400 feet down in darkness and cold, their 351 dead still at their stations in metal coffins. The arithmetic of war reduces lives to numbers. 7 boats, 382 casualties, 15 minutes. But behind every statistic was a man who kissed his family goodbye, boarded a submarine confident in the calculations that would prove wrong, and discovered too late that technology had rendered courage insufficient. Survivors on both sides carried different memories. Germans recalled the terror of watching their world explode and the bitter mercy of enemies who rescued them. The Liberator crew remembered the mechanical execution of a mission, the anti-aircraft fire shredding their aircraft, and the knowledge that each depth charge ended lives with no chance of escape. Industrial war transforms people into components of vast systems where courage counts less than machines, intelligence, and logistics. That afternoon proved this with brutal clarity. The U-boat men died not from lack of bravery or skill, but because they fought with inferior tools. Their sacrifice postponed defeat at best. The last first-hand witness of that engagement, a German machinist's mate rescued by Drumheller, died in 2003 at age 81, And with him passed the final living memory of those 15 minutes that altered submarine warfare forever. What remains are documents, photographs, and an ocean that conceals its past. 7 submarines, 351 dead sailors, reminders that technology overcame courage and industrial power, crushed tactical invention. Up next, you have 2 more standout stories on your screen. If this one resonated, you won't want to miss them. Click through to see both, and don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications so you